Hey everyone, this is Jesus Christ, Chapter 6 of Helmut Wagner, aka Rudolf Sprenger's Bolshevism, Its Roots, Role, Class View, and Methods. Chapter 6 is titled The Use of the Proletariat in the Tactics of Bolshevism. When they began their activity among the Russian workers, the Russian Social Democrats sought to tie up their propaganda with all the interests of the workers. The Bolsheviks were going to, quote, hammer in, end quote, as Zinoviev put it, into as many heads as possible the, quote, principal idea of economic slavery, end quote. From this activity, the economist wing of the Russian Social Democratic movement drew the conclusion that the workers had to limit themselves to the economic struggle and leave the field of politics to the liberals. The economist's credo, therefore, called for the support of the economic struggle of the proletariat and at the same time for the participation of the revolutionary intellectuals in the political activity of the liberal opposition to the autocracy. Though they carried on a bitter struggle against the economists, the Bolsheviks were really closely related to the economists. In accordance with the Kautsky-Leninist theory of class consciousness, the Bolsheviks limited the native capabilities of the proletariat to the economic field, but they also wanted to develop the social democracy into a party that would influence the Russian proletariat, quote, from the outside, end quote, and thus shape the industrial workers of Russia into a weapon that would be serviceable in the fight against Tsarism. The economists and the Mensheviks believed the Russian bourgeoisie to be the directing force of the national revolution of capitalist emancipation. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, deduced from their own, quote, economism, end quote, the historically correct conclusion that it was the intelligentsia manipulating as its, quote, front, end quote, the supposedly politically inept proletariat that would be the guiding force of the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks' ideological war against the economists was an effort to put across the useful idea that the struggle of the workers on the economic field called for a political struggle against Tsarism, of course under the direction of the revolutionary intelligentsia. In fact, the Kautsky-Leninist theory of class consciousness has not at all been borne out by the history of the Russian labor movement. At the end of 1877, there arose in St. Petersburg the so-called Labor Alliance of the North. The Labor Alliance of the North had 200 members, mostly textile workers led by carpenter Chalturnin and the laborer Obnorsky. The workers had some contact with the Narodniki, but they ran quite independently several big strikes and organized by themselves a number of illegal libraries. The educational activity of the alliance was connected both with the economic and political struggles of the workers. The Labor Alliance of the North The Labor Alliance of the North's program was formulated without the collaboration of intellectuals. According to Popov, the worker members of the Alliance of the North stated in their program of principles that, quote, the laboring class must carry on a political struggle and strive to win political freedom because that would facilitate the struggle for socialism, end quote. The Labor Alliance of the North furthermore presented a list of demands similar to the later, quote, minimum, end quote, program of social democracy. As Yaroslavsky writes, the Alliance of the North connected up, quote, quite definitely, the struggle for socialism with the struggle for political freedom, end quote. In this respect, Yaroslavsky says, those workers, quote, anticipated by 4 years the Marxists of the Emancipation of Labor Group as G.W. Plekhanov and the rest, end quote. Yaroslavsky. In other words, the Labor Alliance of the North was, according to the Bolsheviks' own testimony, a piece of an independent labor movement which developed on the economic and political fields in the direction of proletarian socialism sometime before the first peep of Marxism among the Russian intellectuals. The Russian workers gave signs of socialist consciousness before socialism was discovered by the Russian intelligentsia itself. The Russian workers showed tendencies of political class consciousness sometime before the intellectuals Plekhanov, Kautsky, and Lenin devised the theory that such a development was impossible. The Russian workers had a glimpse of, quote, Marxism, end quote, before the Russian intelligentsia came upon it, apparently by virtue of the Leninist theory of the, quote, independent development of ideas, end quote. The labor strikes in the 80s and 90s were nearly all spontaneous affairs. Popov records that they were carried, quote, on, quote, almost entirely without the participation of the socialist intellectuals, end quote. Popov. The first pure worker organization arose in Russia in the course of these strikes. About the same time, some politically advanced workers began to enter the contemporary revolutionary circles, which were for the most part short-lived. Besides the emigre, quote, emancipation of labor, end quote, group, there already existed in Russia a number of small revolutionary organizations which expressed a social democratic viewpoint and had connections with the industrial workers. At the head of the most important of these organizations was the engineer Brusniev. Popov describes Brusniev as a, quote, link between the first St. Petersburg social democratic circles of the 80s and the activities of the St. Petersburg, quote, League for the Emancipation of the Working Class, end quote, of the 1990s, end quote. Brusniev's circle included advanced workers as Bogdanov, Shelgunov, Fyodor Afanasyev, and others. Similar social democratic groups having connection with workers arose toward the close of the 80s in Odessa, Kharkov, and Kiev. But these organizations too merely continued the work begun by the previous South Russian Alliance of Labor. The increased class consciousness of the Russian workers showed itself through their economic struggles and their attempts at political organization. About 1900, there took place in the important cities of the country a number of worker demonstrations in which students also participated. The demonstrators carried slogans expressing their opposition to the autocracy. Popov is obliged to observe that, quote, in these demonstrations, the workers marched before the socialist groups, end quote. The initiative in this activity came from the workers. The history of the Russian labor movement shows that nearly all the Russian labor movement's great events, both during the first and second revolutions, occurred, quote, spontaneously, end quote, taking unawares and dragging behind them the Bolshevik, quote, general staff, end quote. Not incorrectly, Lenin called the St. Petersburg Bloody Sunday, which ushered in the 1905 revolution, a piece of history, quote, made by the worker masses without the aid of social democracy, end quote. Lenin. Similarly, the December uprising in Moscow broke out without the intervention of the labor organizations. Of the leader organizations. Like 1905, so 1917, the February Revolution took the Bolsheviki by surprise. Pokrovsky writes in his history that, quote, the Bolsheviki had no thought of an armed uprising at the moment, end quote. Indeed, at the order of the Bolsheviki Central Committee, Shlepnikov forbade at that time the organization of combatant groups and the arming of the workers. The 8-hour day was won in St. Petersburg, March 1917, entirely upon the initiative of the mass of workers, without the help or, quote, leadership, end quote, of any party. In April of the same year, the revolutionary regiments of the Petrograd garrison left their barracks, without the advice of any political leaders, and overthrew the semi-monarchist Milyukov government. In July, after the Bolsheviks postponed their much-advertised demonstrations, there took place a spontaneous armed demonstration of the Petrograd workers and soldiers. After the collapse of Kornilov's venture, began the general expulsion of capitalist managers and engineers from the factories of the city. This happened without the direction or advice of any of the revolutionary parties. Only in October did the Bolsheviki, under Lenin's energetic and insistent leadership, succeed in clambering abreast of their specific historic role. It was a new, predominantly peasant wave of mass discontent an action that lifted the Bolsheviks to the opportunity to win political power. So that, though the Russian working class had given proof of considerable political aptitude, the Russian working class finally had to forego independent action. The Russian working class was taken in tow by Bolshevism. This was possible because the Russian working class was a minority in a predominantly peasant country, and because a bourgeois, not a proletarian revolution, was on the order of the day. The Bolsheviki were interested in developing the consciousness of the Russian proletariat only to the degree that they could direct it toward, quote, democratism, end quote, toward a policy of alliance with the peasants and other bourgeois revolutionary issues. By subjecting the numerically weak Russian proletariat to their own historic tactics, they made of it the most radical and most effective instrument of the Russian Revolution. The Russian working class became the hammer which, held in the fist of the Bolshevik party, not only tattered Tsarism and a vestige of the feudal regime, but also destroyed the forms of the parliamentary bourgeois state that arose in the country as a result of the February Revolution. With the aid of this tool, the Bolsheviki erected the state form that best suited the specific needs of the Bolsheviki's rule and appeared to offer the only possible political framework in which the development of the productive forces of the country could be advanced. The Russian proletariat was mustered into the service of the Bolsheviki by the means of such demands as the call for the Constituent Assembly. The significance of these demands at the time they were broadcast was precisely that through them the mass of industrial workers could be drawn into the fray in behalf of the Bolshevik aims. The important question for the Bolsheviki is not what ideas arose in the workers' minds as a result of these slogans. What the workers thought was less important to the Bolsheviki than the action of the workers in the service of Bolshevism. It did not even matter if such actions arose in response to a viewpoint and hopes which were, quote, false, end quote, considered from the angle of the historic aims of Bolshevism. It did not matter if such action did not coincide with the best interests of the Russian proletariat and failed to aid the development of the Russian proletariat's class understanding. The Bolsheviki were the head of the movement. Their first and only concern was to be in a position to control the rest of the body at will. In the general plan of the Bolsheviki's campaign for winning power, the Russian industrial workers were assigned the task of acting as the, quote, vanguard, end quote, of a revolution that was essentially a peasant mass act. In his collection, Lenin, Zinoviev wrote, quote, Comrade Lenin was the first to recognize that all attempts of single revolutionists hailing from the intelligentsia to incite the peasantry to a mass uprising would meet with failure. Lenin understood that only the workers could enter the villages and that only the industrial proletariat was in the position to move into action the millioned mass of the peasant population to which it was closely related, end quote. Neither was this a discovery of Lenin's. Already in 1887, writing in the second program of the Emancipation of Labor Group, Plekhanov noted that, quote, the proletarian who had been thrown out of the village as an impoverished member of the agricultural community returns to the village as a social democratic agitator, end quote. The line of action that was pursued by the Bolsheviki had been indicated by Plekhanov at the beginning of the development of the Russian social democracy. And before Plekhanov, it was already applied by the Narodniki. By possessing themselves of the political direction of the proletariat, the Bolsheviki also possessed themselves of the opportunity to direct the peasantry. By possessing themselves of the political direction of the proletariat, the Bolsheviki also possessed themselves of the opportunity to direct the peasantry. This is the social significance of Bolshevism. Bolshevism was a movement of the Russian intelligentsia. Bolshevism was a movement of the Russian intelligentsia. Bolshevism enlisted in Bolshevism's service the two revolutionary classes of Russia, the industrial workers and peasantry. Bolshevism enlisted in its service the two revolutionary classes of Russia, the industrial worker and peasantry. Bolshevism realized its aims through the action of these two classes. It won state power under a disguise of socialist ideology. The Russian Revolution was carried through by the Russian proletariat, acting as the dependable instrument of the Bolshevik intelligentsia. But the Russian workers did not and could not decide the course or content of the national revolution. That is the end of chapter 6 of Rudolf Sprenger, or Helmut Wagner's Bolshevism, Its Roots, Role, Class View, and Methods. This has been chapter 6, The Use of the Proletariat in the Tactics of Bolshevism. Thank you for listening.